In this module, we're going to look at decision making and what cognitive science has contributed to our understanding of decision making in everyday life. And what's interesting about decision making is that we do this all the time, and it comes up in a wide variety of circumstances. So, normally speaking, if we were taking this course on campus, some of you guys would have chosen to take the Ben Franklin Bridge to get to campus from Philadelphia, or driven your car from the suburbs, some of you to campus to park, some of you to the Patco station to take the train. And all of those possibilities are perfectly decent decisions to get to campus. Yet by making one decision and choosing one of those options, we are also eliminating all of the other options that were available. So even if you just look at the Ben Franklin Bridge, you could of course drive across it, you could take the train across it, you could bike across it, you could walk across it. So how do people come up with everyday decisions like that, and how do people handle more complex decisions? Are there ways in which people are systematic that can help us understand decision making in a broader sense? So what are some central issues in this regard? Well, first of all, I want you guys to realize that decisions are omnipresent and they're inevitable. And what I mean by that is you have to decide to act, because if you don't act, then you will not survive. So in other words, you have to make decisions and choose actions for the sake of survival. Second point is that at any given point in time, the number of possible alternatives that you can choose from, right, number of actions, number of things you're going to do in the day, all of those sorts of things, is practically infinite. So how do we get from the availability of an infinite amount of possibilities to actually choosing the one thing that we end up doing? This problem is difficult because when we make a decision, most of the time the outcome of that decision is a priori, meaning beforehand, unknown. There's always some sort of level of uncertainty. And this holds true when you decide to take a certain course in college. Is that worthwhile? Is the instructor going to be okay? And so forth. It holds true when you're going to buy a house. Is this a good house? Is this not a good house? Is there something wrong with this? Same for a car. Even when you're going to buy a box of cereal, most of the time you assume that the product you're expecting is going to be in that box, but it has happened in history that was not actually true, or that the product had actually gone bad so that you couldn't actually consume it. So in other words, any decision you make, there's always a level of uncertainty. So that already makes it more difficult. And it's even worse than that, because most of the time, different kinds of alternatives are very different from one another. So, do you want to spend the day going to the beach, or do you want to spend the day doing your schoolwork so that you get a better grade? Or do you want to spend the day going to your part-time job to make some money? Or do you want to spend the day to go hang out with friends and have a good time? We negotiate these possibilities against each other all the time. And it raises a question, if we want to understand decision making, how on earth this actually works. So there are some guiding questions in this regard. How do people decide between different courses of action or non-action? Right? Deciding not to act is also a choice. Are people rational in this regard? Do they tend to pick what's best? And if not, are there other ways in which we can understand their decision making and kind of predict it? And then, of course, why is it that some people make much better decisions than others? I know that all of you guys have come across this either by your own poor decision making, or looking at friends and family members and thinking, what on earth were you thinking? Right? So how exactly does this whole business of decision making work? There's some theoretical issues. The first one I already alluded to. So when we weigh different alternatives against each other, the difficulty is that we're really comparing apples and oranges. The technical GRE word kind of way of saying that is that the units are not commensurate. It's not that everything we consider is expressible in number of dollars, or in the amount of time, or in the amount of happiness, or anything like that. There's very different units associated with different decisions, and somehow we weigh those against each other. It's very difficult to figure out how that works. If we acted rationally all the time, then always, or at least predominantly, it should be that people actually make the best possible choices. Again, this is difficult because it does assume that we actually know what the outcomes of these choices are going to be and then decide based on them. But let's say hypothetically we knew all the possible choices and what their outcomes were, then it should be the case that people always make the best choices. So that's a question if that's true or not. Then there's the issue that people, of course, make decisions under a very, very large range of contexts. And we can look at influences of different factors. What is the effect of time pressure on decision making? What is the effect of importance, either in terms of money that's being spent or emotionally? What's the investment of staying in a relationship versus leaving? What amount of expertise does the person have when they're making a decision about something? And how much uncertainty is really present? Are we dealing with large uncertainty, small uncertainty? If it's very uncertain and it's an important decision, how do people handle that? If it's very uncertain, it's not such an important decision, then maybe it's not such a big deal, and so forth. Now you can tell already that to actually study this is pretty difficult, but yet economists have really been the first field of study that tried to start to tackle this. And the reason for this is pretty clear. Follow the money trail. Economists try to understand markets and they try to understand consumer behavior, because the more they understand that, the more they can predict the market, the more they can invest in smart ways, and the more they can then make large amounts of money, right? Or keep the economy going in the best way possible. So we'll start with that, and it's a good field of study to start with, just because at least there we can look at some decision making when the units and the alternatives are relatively well defined. We can have different alternatives that have different outcomes, either gains or losses, and then there we can assign some sort of value, how much gain and how much loss is associated with each of the different decisions. Now, in order to do this, economists or economic theories on decision making do make a couple of assumptions. One of them is that it provides normative standards, meaning it's actually assigning a value to a decision, and then we can figure out whether certain decisions are negative or positive, how negative and how positive they are, and then we can see how people decide relative to those normative standards. And in this regard, we can look at two different things, and this is an important distinction. We can look at the expected value. What is the objective net worth of an outcome? And so this is like saying, okay, you bought a certain stock, a month later it had a particular objective value, and we can do that for different stocks and then quantify the actual objective net worth of an outcome. That's the expected value. This gets more complicated though, and economists don't like this, but this is unfortunately how decision making works. People mostly make decisions based on expected utility, not just expected value. What this means is, what is the subjective value of an outcome? So how much is this particular outcome worth subjectively to this particular person? And to illustrate the difference, think of me giving you guys $100 bill. Now, I don't know about your personal economic situation, but I'm assuming that all of you would be pretty damn happy if I just gave you $100 out of the blue. So the subjective value of that outcome is probably fairly positive. Okay. Now let's say that I also happen to have this student in my course who signed up for some reason just to kill some time, and his name happens to be Bill Gates, and I give him a $100 bill. The expected utility, the subjective value of getting that $100 bill, is probably going to be lower than that $100 bill is for you guys, right? So depending on your personal wealth, $100 is not just $100. It depends on where you are in life. So this is probably a guiding measure for how people make decisions, but of course subjective value is very difficult to quantify because it differs from person to person. That's the very definition for something to be subjective. So for the time being, we're going to leave that part alone, and we're going to look at how economists then moved forward to try to kind of quantify different decisions, different values, and then predict what kind of decisions people should be making. The way in which they set this up was based on the notion of a decision tree. And I'm going to keep this really simple so that you only see that in this particular case we only have a couple of options, okay? And let's say your option is the following. There's this person you like in the course, okay? And you thought of maybe asking that person out on a date. However, complicating factor is that the next day you do happen to have a test in a class, and you know from previous experience and from reasonable logic that if you study, you're probably going to get a better grade on that exam than if you don't. Okay? So you have two options. Either you decide, the heck with the studying, I'm going to ask this person on a date. That's this decision branch right here. And then asking that person out for a date, there's two different possibilities. Keep it simple. That person accepts, there's some likelihood of that, and you have a good time. Or the person rejects you, and it's actually a negative experience. On the other hand, up here, you see that, let's say you go studying, it's guaranteed, right? Probability of 1 or 100% chance that you get a better grade. So what you see in this decision tree is a couple of things. There's different alternatives that have different branches. Then there's different beliefs about how likely these alternatives are. So if you go and study, pretty much 100% chance, right? P of 1, that you're going to get a better grade. On the other hand, here it gets trickier. You ask the person out on a date, and let's say you think that there's about a 60% chance, or a P of 0.06, that this person will accept going on a date, and a 40% chance of being rejected. And then each of those outcomes also has a certain consequence, which can be either positive or negative. And this is where it gets somewhat tricky, but let's say we somehow know how much these different options are worth to this individual person that we're particularly considering right now. Let's say for this person, if they study more and get a better grade, that's worth 25 points of expected utility. If they go on a date and have a great time, that's worth 50 points of expected utility. And then if they get rejected, that's actually worth negative 40 points of expected utility. So given these probabilities and these numbers, what should a person do? Should they go study, or should they go and ask this person on a date? Now, of course, by the way, you have to then keep in mind that we're assuming that these two are mutually exclusive possibilities. You couldn't do both, right? You couldn't study and go on a date. So that's sort of fixed here. And the other thing that's fixed here is that if you get shut down, then that doesn't mean you have enough time left to go studying. I guess you're reeling from the rejection and so put down by it that there's no way that you could study. So it's either this option, go study, or this option, ask a person for a date, and then either go on it or don't go on it. Okay? Now, how do people then figure out what the best path is here? Well, utility theory would say the following. It focuses on how people should make decisions while de-emphasizing how they actually make them. But what you would do is the following. You assess the expected utility of different outcomes. And that's actually the multiplication of these numbers. So what we do is that we take the probability of each action alternative and multiply it by the subjective value attached to that outcome, which, by the way, before I called mistakenly expected utility, that's the subjective value. You multiply them and then sum them up. And then the projection based on rational decision making would be that people always choose the one with the highest expected utility. So let me walk you through that. We have two decision branches here. The first one is this one, go study, has a probability of 1, and we multiply it by this subjective value of 25. So this branch here has an expected utility of 1 multiplied by 25 is 25 positive points. Here, on the bottom, go on a date or ask somebody on a date, there's two possibilities. There's a 60% chance, or a 0.6 probability of getting 50 points, of having a good time. So the expected value here is 0.6 multiplied by 50, which is positive 30. But this branch also has the negative possibility of getting rejected, and that chance is 40%, or 0.4, multiplied by negative 40, so that's negative 16. So 30 on the top, negative 16 on the bottom, this decision branch has an expected utility of 30 minus 16 is only 14 points, whereas this one has 25 points. So if people made rational decisions, they should then always go study, never ask someone on a date, and never procreate.